Good evening, everyone. I think we'll get started. It's just about 7 o'clock. Welcome to Hagley Museum and Library. I'm Jill McKenzie, Hagley's Executive Director. And before we begin, I'd like to ask everyone to please silence their cell phone in case you haven't done that yet. I see a lot of hands going for pockets, so that's probably a good thing. Tonight is a very special time for Hagley as we welcome our friends from Jefferson's Poplar Forest in Lynchburg, Virginia, for an informative discussion on landscapes, ideas, and intellectual adventures, the worlds of Jefferson and DuPont. As evidenced by the collections items that I hope everyone saw downstairs, Jefferson had a long association with the DuPonts. And it was a multidimensional relationship that spanned decades and touched on everything from politics to travel to architecture, even to merino sheep. I think of Thomas Jefferson and Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours as kindred spirits, and we'll learn more about that this evening. We're really in for a treat as our Hagley historian, Lucas Clausen, leads a discussion with Travis McDonald, who was the architectural historian who was responsible for the restoration of Poplar Forest, and Bill Barker, or should I say, Thomas Jefferson himself. To get our evening started, I'd like to introduce Dr. Catherine Pumphrey, who had the idea for this wonderful collaboration, and Allison Ramsey, who's the executive director of Poplar Forest. And we thank Poplar Forest for their support for this event tonight. Dr. Catherine Pumphrey is a native of Wilmington, Delaware, though she has lived in Lynchburg, Virginia for a little more than 43 years. She holds a doctoral degree from the University of Virginia and has been a career fundraiser, having served as a fundraising executive for a number of different professions, including healthcare and higher education. She recently retired from her position of 21 years as the executive vice president of the Centra Health Foundation. Catherine has served on numerous community boards, including the Corporation for Jefferson's Poplar Forest, where she is the immediate past chair of the board of directors. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Catherine Pumphrey.
Good evening. It is wonderful to look out and see so many people with us tonight. As Jill mentioned, I am the immediate past chair of the board of directors of Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest. 2 years ago, my husband, Richard, who is here tonight, and I visited Hagley and toured the mills and the DuPont home. I might add that I have fond memories of visiting Hagley while growing up in Wilmington, and I was very anxious to return. It was during our tour of the mansion that I discovered portraits of both Jefferson and Lafayette hanging on the walls in the library, and I instantly had an aha moment. Having read extensively on the life of Thomas Jefferson, I knew that he and P.S. DuPont had a friendship, but at this point, I was not aware of the extent. It was not until a few months later, while having a dinner conversation with Bill Barker, Mr. Jefferson, that I learned from him about the depth of the Jefferson-DuPont friendship and about their correspondence over the years that touched on everything from religion and agriculture to politics and education. It was at this moment that I thought that a joint program with Poplar Forest and Hagley would be a wonderful way to bring the organizations together. Last July, I met with Jill McKenzie and some of the Hagley staff, and she graciously agreed to co-host tonight's program so that we could learn more about Jefferson and the DuPont friendship. We also thought that this would be a wonderful way to introduce Hagley, the Hagley membership, to Thomas Jefferson's restored second home in Bedford County, Virginia, Poplar Forest. As you will learn tonight, Thomas Jefferson spent many weeks after his retirement from the presidency visiting his beloved retreat. Thank you so much again for attending tonight's event. And on behalf of the Poplar Forest Board of Directors, I'd like to thank Jill McKenzie and all of her staff for all of their hard work making this event possible. I would also like to thank Lucas Clausen, Bill Barker, Travis McDonald for agreeing to present tonight's program. We hope that all of you will join us soon in Central Virginia to learn why Thomas Jefferson called Poplar Forest one of the best dwelling houses in Virginia. It is now my pleasure to introduce Allison Ramsey, the CEO of Jefferson's Poplar Forest, and she will share a brief history with you. Allison joined the professional staff of Poplar Forest in 2002 and served as Director of Development from 2012 until 2019. She assumed the role of CEO in 2020. She is well-versed in nonprofit fundraising and administration. Allison implemented the New Path to Jefferson capital campaign that resulted in the construction of a new 2-mile parkway entrance and trail system for Poplar Forest. I might mention to you that this new trail system and entrance to Poplar Forest follows a route noted by Jefferson as the future entrance to the property. Allison holds a BA degree in Historic Preservation and Art History from the University of Mary Washington and an MA from the University of Virginia in Urban and Environmental Planning. She lives in Lynchburg with her husband, Peter, and their 3 teenage daughters. Please welcome Allison Ramsey. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Catherine, for that wonderful set of remarks and introduction, and thank you for launching this great idea for tonight's program. I am Allison Ramsey, the President and CEO of Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest, and it's really wonderful to be with you all this evening. We really enjoyed meeting several of you downstairs, and we look forward to tonight's program and hopefully meeting several others afterwards. I'm joined here tonight by several of my colleagues, so I want to quickly introduce before we get started and acknowledge our fabulous Director of Development, Renee Flowers, who's there in the back. Hopefully many of you had a chance to meet her earlier, and our recently retired Director of Architectural Restoration, Travis McDonald, who you'll hear from very soon and learn how just eternally devoted he is to Poplar Forest. And of course, our dear friend, Mr. Bill Barker, who portrays Thomas Jefferson, who I know you will all get such a thrill out of hearing tonight. So this is such a beautiful area, and we've really enjoyed the warm welcome that you all have given us. Very grateful to Jill and her staff for welcoming us to do this program tonight, and certainly our visit here will be too short, so we look forward to making a return visit sometime soon. As you know, this evening's program will focus on the fascinating connections and long correspondence between Thomas Jefferson and E.I. DuPont, a subject I know we are all very eager to learn more about. But before we begin, I want to set the stage with a brief history of Poplar Forest, Thomas Jefferson's villa retreat, located in Forest, Virginia, about 11 miles outside of Lynchburg, and 78 miles from Jefferson's primary residence at Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia. The plantation and the enslaved people living and working at Poplar Forest were inherited by Jefferson in 1773, when he was just 30 years old upon the death of his father-in-law, John Wales. It was a working tobacco plantation, providing a major source of income for Jefferson. An overseer's house on the plantation famously provided safe harbor for Jefferson and his family in 1781 when they evaded the British who endeavored to capture Virginia's governor at Monticello. In need of respite from Monticello, where visitors and the curious public demanded so much of Jefferson's time and attention, Jefferson began thinking of Poplar Forest as a place for a private and intimate retreat. He drew plans for the octagonal house during his second term as president, with construction beginning in 1806. In 1809, after leaving office, Jefferson traveled to Poplar Forest 3 to 4 times per year, staying from 2 weeks to 2 months per visit, often around planting seasons. Poplar Forest offered Jefferson a much-needed place to read, study, think, and provided an opportunity for precious family time with his 2 teenage granddaughters, Ellen and Cornelia Randolph. As you will hear from Travis, Poplar Forest is considered Jefferson's most perfect architectural work, a synthesis of elements and ideas formulated through a lifetime of study and experimentation, and one that Travis and his team of highly skilled craftsmen spent 34 years restoring. Jefferson left the property for the last time in 1823 and gave the house, the land, and the enslaved people to his grandson, Francis Epps. Poplar Forest passed through a number of owners over the years, survived a major fire in 1845, and was deteriorating rapidly during its last private ownership in the early 1980s. The tremendous vision and resources of a dedicated group of private citizens rescued the house in 1983 with the formation of the nonprofit Corporation for Jefferson's Poplar Forest. It opened for public tours for the first time in 1986, and our visitors witnessed its restoration right before their eyes over the course of 3 decades. Last year, we proudly celebrated the 40th anniversary of the founding of the corporation and our many achievements, including the reacquisition of 617 acres of original plantation lands, the completed restoration of the retreat and portions of the designed landscape, the construction of the new entrance road and trail system, new exhibits focused on Poplar Forest enslaved residents, and our ever-expanding array of programming for visitors of all ages. As we enter this next phase of our development, we are focused on leveraging our accomplishments to achieve a new level of visibility and impact at this public historic site. We are working with partners around the Commonwealth on a new initiative focused on the origins, impact, and lasting legacy of the Declaration of Independence to foster civic engagement as we lead into the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding in 2026. We recently secured funding to stabilize and restore the only standing structure on our property to have housed enslaved individuals, a testament to our commitment to share the stories of all who lived and worked at Poplar Forest, and to provide places and spaces where everyone can engage with our shared American history. I welcome you to learn more about Poplar Forest by visiting our website, signing up for our newsletter, and hopefully traveling to Central Virginia to tour and spend time in our area. It would be our absolute pleasure to host you, and we thank you again for allowing us to spend some time with you here tonight. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jill McKenzie to introduce tonight's program. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, Catherine. So I am really honored to be able to introduce our 3 speakers for this evening. Lucas Clausen is the Hagley historian, and he works with our historical records to provide public programs such as the program this evening, to work with the public and our staff and our members to make sense of all the collections that we have here, and as well to do scholarly research. Of the many topics that Lucas has lectured about, he's talked about the DuPont Company, the DuPont family, the Manhattan Project, which is on a lot of our minds over the last couple years, and the American Civil War. Lucas is a graduate of Appalachian State University with a BS and MA in Public and Applied History, and he holds an MA from the University of Delaware in American History and the History of Technology, which is actually from the Hagley program. Lucas has been with Hagley since 2007. Travis McDonald is an architectural historian who was hired to direct the restoration of Poplar Forest in 1989. He retired in 2023 after, and I want to emphasize this, that 34-year project was completed. Talk about dedication. A native of Galveston, Texas, he received a degree in American history from the University of Texas and a graduate degree in architectural history from the University of Virginia. He formerly worked for the Chief Historical Architect of the National Park Service, for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and he has directed museum restorations in Virginia for more than 40 years. He's received numerous awards, including the University of Virginia School of Architecture's Distinguished Alumni Award in 2021. Now, Bill Barker is a veteran historical actor-interpreter at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. For more than 20 years, he portrayed Thomas Jefferson at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation's Nation Builder program. More than a decade prior to joining Colonial Williamsburg, Barker was invited to take on the persona of Jefferson at Philadelphia's Independence Hall. And he began his life's work of continued performance and scholarship of our nation's third president. He has performed as Jefferson at Monticello and Poplar Forest, at the White House, at the US Capitol, at the National Archives, and at a number of venues through Europe. Barker is the same height, weight, and general appearance as Jefferson. I guess that comes in handy, right? But he is so much so like Jefferson that he actually modeled for two statues of Jefferson, one at the Jefferson Library at West Point and the other for the Visitor Center entrance at the US Capitol in Richmond, Virginia. A native of Philadelphia, Barker earned a BA from Villanova University. So let's please welcome our distinguished speakers.
I don't think we need this. Let me see if I can turn it off. Is it? Okay. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Nice to see you all here. When Lucas asked me to speak on the introduction to Poplar Forest, which is the shortest talk I've ever given, it was a challenge. Only to be surpassed by the time somebody asked me to speak without images. So let's see if we can get started here. So you probably know a lot more about the DuPont family than I do, but I want to start with a letter that Jefferson sends his friend Pierre DuPont, who's by this time in 1809 back in Paris. So on March 2nd, 1809, Jefferson writes from what was called the President's House. Within a few days, I retired to my family, my books, and farms. And having gained the harbor myself, shall look on my friends still buffeting the storm. With anxiety indeed, but not with envy. Never did a prisoner released from his chains feel such relief as I shall on shaking off the shackles of power. Nature intended me for the tranquil pursuits of science by rendering them my supreme delight. So Jefferson was sitting here in the unfinished President's House. He actually never lived in a finished house his whole lifetime. And he is sending many letters to all of his friends, almost in a giddy way about getting out of public life, going back to his family, his farms, and his books. Most people have not included books on that list, but Jefferson always did. And of course, this is where he was planning to retire to, but Monticello was probably the second best known private house in America, and therefore he could not get the peace and quiet he needed there, even though he on and on and on talks about looking forward to tranquility. Where he's going to get that tranquility is the resort the retreat that he has already put into place before he leaves the office. So as Allison said, in 1806, he starts construction of his ultimate retreat in central Virginia, just on the east side of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And this was just the ultimate in a lifetime of using retreats. When he's a boy, he has a retreat. When he's governor, he has a retreat. When he's in Paris, he has a retreat. Philadelphia, New York. He's a man who needs a retreat for peace and quiet. And so Monticello was not going to afford him that peace. At Monticello, you hear about how he locks himself in his private suite, and only the few family members that ever get in to see him there. It's like he's a prisoner in his own house. And if you understand that, you understand Poplar Forest. So Poplar Forest was a 3-day journey to the southwest of Monticello, and it was probably picked for his retreat because it was remote. People who tried to find him at Monticello weren't going to follow him there, mainly because they didn't know about it. This was a well-kept secret. Just over the mountain from Poplar Forest in the Shenandoah Valley was one of the 2 great natural wonders of early East Coast America. And Jefferson had even gone and measured this place, the natural bridge, when he was in his 20s. So a year after he gets the Poplar Forest property in 1773, he buys what he calls the most sublime of nature's wonders from England, because he had to own it. It was that important. And if he walked into the DuPont house near here today, he would be very pleased to see in this French Zuber wallpaper, Scenes of North America, the natural bridge. I think Lucas tells me it came a little later in the house history, but still, Jefferson would have been very pleased to see it there. What Jefferson designed was very unusual. This was the ultimate in octagon designs that he had played with starting when he was a college student at William & Mary, when he's learning to design buildings on his own. And there are hundreds of octagon designs that he plays with his whole lifetime. This is the ultimate. It's the first full-size octagon house in America, and it became a very idealistic project for him. And it could be very idealistic because it's an occasional retreat. So starting in 1806, while he's still stuck in Washington, he sends letters down to Bedford County to the workers, and the workers are sending letters back. It's being built by some hired white workers who had just finished Monticello in 1809, and some enslaved workers, including the master enslaved carpenter John Hemmings, and more importantly, John Hemmings' 3 nephew apprentices who are Jefferson's biracial sons. They worked building their father's dream house for 10 years. Very poignant story. So Jefferson puts this in motion so that 1809, the minute he gets out of public life, he can start using Poplar Forest. What is it then? It's just a shell. It's enclosed for the weather, but it's totally unfinished. Did that matter? No. As I said, he'd never lived in a finished house. And so he starts coming there, but it takes him 17 years to finish it. Now, if he told no one about this, if he only invited 2 foreign friends to come there, it didn't have to be his most perfect work. It could have been a rustic retreat. Why did it take him 17 years to build this perfect place? Because he wanted to. He wanted one exquisite thing for himself. You might think of it not only as a retreat, but as a treat to Jefferson. So Jefferson starts coming there, And he spends a lot of time, if you add up the amount of time he spent there over 14 years, it's a huge part of his retirement life that almost nobody knew about. It was the big missing chapter of his later life, and virtually nobody knew about it. So let me read another quote. In 1815, Jefferson is writing Pierre Dupont, who's still in Paris. I am just setting out to a distant possession of mine and shall be absent 3 weeks. 3 weeks is about the shortest amount of time he ever went there. And in 1817, September 9th, and I was shocked to see the original letter out in the lobby here, Jefferson writes E.I. Dupont from Poplar Forest because he heard about E.I.'s father's death. And Jefferson says, your letter of the 11th August, after a long detention at Monticello, is received at this place, where I have now been upwards of a month. I have seen in the public papers the unwelcome event it announced. I had been happy in his friendship upwards of 30 years, for he was one of my early intimates in France. So that's a very kind of coincidental object that Lucas put out there in the lobby, that same original letter. Jefferson starts bringing 2 teenage granddaughters, and his grandson is also in school nearby. But what he does there is he reads, he writes, and he thinks. He usually came with one servant, and it is a very intimate place, and it can be intimate and idealistic because one man is primarily using it. He couldn't live without books. He had his own Poplar Forest library of 1,000 books in 5 languages. It's not the stuff he needs for government or law. It's the stuff he wants to go back to, things that he loved in college. And if he had come to see E.I. Dupont here, he would have been very amazed to see a 4,000 book library sitting in the house here. In 1823, Jefferson is almost finished with the house, but his grandson, Francis Epps, got married. And so Jefferson says, you should have a house. I'll give you Poplar Forest. So he reluctantly turned it over to Francis, thinking it would stay in the family. Francis lives there for 5 years, 1823, 1828, and then goes down to be a pioneer in the newest American frontier in 1828. You know where that is? Florida. Northern Florida. Francis Epps is a pioneer down there. First lives in a log cabin, eventually as governor has a big house and starts a college just like his grandfather did. So Jefferson might have been proud of Francis, although sad that he left the house. So the house goes out of the Jefferson family in 1828. A neighbor buys it, and as Allison said, there is a fire in 1845 that really gives those people living there an opportunity to do what they said, make some valuable improvements in the house. This is one of the most incredible neoclassical houses in the world. They want to improve it. What does that mean? They want a good old farmhouse. So you can see they bricked up 8 windows, they altered the roof, they altered all the nice Roman classical moldings. That was the first big change in the house's history. The second big change came 100 years later when the last family that lived there wanted a modern country house. So what's that mean? 5 bathrooms, kitchens, mechanical systems. So this is where I come into the picture, and we're asking, where is Jefferson in this picture? It kind of looks Jeffersonian, but not quite. So that was the beginning of a long, slow, and also idealistic process of looking at every square inch over and over and over, answering all the questions to go with the many letters Jefferson was sending from the White House to instruct his workers. Going through this investigation was a process of building the house on paper to see for the very first time what Jefferson had really designed and built. And what we realized is it's this very idealistic, idiosyncratic masterpiece of Jefferson. And just to give you an example of how it's designed for privacy, Jefferson struggled with where to put the stairs in this two-story house. Everywhere he could think of was going to mess up the geometry, so he sticks them on the outside. But you only get to the stairs by going through someone's bedchamber. That tells you that he does not intend any public to ever be in the house. It's all about privacy. And we also finally confirmed that there was a wonderful 20-foot cube in the middle of the house that had been reduced after the fire of 1845. And of course, confirmation of the French alcove beds in the house. So, as you can imagine, a lot of conservation to keep the house standing. Then it was a process of following Jefferson's actual construction sequence as we rebuilt the house with the same materials, the same processes, the same tools, but most importantly, in the same sequence of year after year, because we know what he does every year for 17 years. So these are, in effect, Jeffersonian processes that visitors are watching year after year as they come and see the construction of the house. And Jefferson also had the cutest little octagonal privies. You could call these Palladian temples of convenience. Although when the elder DuPont came back here in 1815, is that right, from France, he criticized his son for having outdoor privies that he called necessaries, and he told somebody to order the best water closets from England. One of the most conspicuous missing parts of Poplar Forest was a 100-foot service wing on the east side of the house that had 4 rooms serving the house. This was a 9-year project to put the wing back together, putting Jefferson's signature terrace roof together, which was really his only architectural invention, which was a flat roof on a hidden roof system. Just like the 200-foot wings he had stuck on the White House. And so once the work came back into the house, all of the interior woodwork, every square inch of it was done by hand with antique hand planes, antique tools, even Jefferson-era poplar wood from the poplar forest, which was around the house. So as we put one piece together after another, it was just like Jefferson seeing one thing after another, year after year. It was a very rare experience to see what he saw. And he wasn't skimping on things like moldings in a tertiary space like the passage. He wanted the most proper Roman classical moldings throughout the whole house. And that included the Doric order entablature at the top of the 20-foot dining room, which is the last thing Jefferson saw when he came in 1823. This entablature alone was 1,700 parts. One of the last things of putting the house back together year before last was one of the most exciting, which is watching these historic painters hand make old types of paints called distemper, which goes on black and then within a couple hours turns this wonderful gray color and texture. Distempers really haven't been used much since Jefferson's time, but it's a wonderful finish. And that includes handmade linseed oil paints on all the interior woodwork. So what can we say about what architecture Jefferson is creating? So in some books, there's even a separate chapter called Jeffersonian Classicism. He has his own brand of Roman classicism, but I also like to think of this as an architectural melting pot. He's taking things from the ancient Roman world. He's taken a lot from the Renaissance world of Palladio and his villas. He's taking things from the 18th century Virginia world, and he puts it all together in a unique way that is pure Jefferson. And this has been really the missing link to understanding all of his architecture. What went before Monticello, what went after the University of Virginia. It's all related, and it's all now complete. We could talk a lot here about the Palladian influences of Poplar Forest, especially the Villa Rotunda, which you can see is very symmetrical like Poplar Forest, but we don't have time. I will mention that the most Palladian thing was the landscape, where Jefferson's using two mounds with trees connected to the house by trees, mimicking a Palladian five-part plan. Very unique. We could talk a lot about the mathematics and the idealistic world of numbers at Poplar Forest. Jefferson could do 6 types of math. This was all about numbers, proportions, and they go from the middle of the house out into the landscape. But I'm sorry, we don't have time to talk about that. What I want to talk about, though, is the French connection. So this is very important because, as you probably know, Jefferson spent 5 years living in Paris and traveling around Europe. That's where he became buddies with Pierre Dupont and many other people. And there are many things about Poplar Forest that are French and modern. It's one of the very, very few houses in America that had a skylight, but they were all over Paris, all over Europe. The glass doors that he called sash doors are very French, giving you light and sight all through the house. The polished oak floors are very French. When Jefferson is telling his workers to do these oak floors, he says, all the best houses of Europe have floors like this. And it just so happens that one of the 2 European people came to visit Jefferson, George Flower, wrote a description of the house in 1816. He says, I found Mr. Jefferson at his Poplar Forest estate in the western part of the state of Virginia. His house was built after the fashion of a French chateau. Octagon rooms, floors of polished oak, lofty ceilings, large mirrors betokened his French taste, acquired by his long residence in France. So here was an Englishman who recognizes the Frenchness of Poplar Forest. We could also talk about how he breaks down the walls and lets in the exterior, which is very French. When he's living in Paris, people almost live outdoors because the weather is so perfect. But French houses are known to be open to the exterior. This is the parlor with these floor-to-ceiling sash windows. They're all hung, triple hung. And also the south portico, which was not a place to go up and down with stairs. It's an outdoor room like he used to use in Paris. And even more importantly, the 100-foot deck. All the trouble to do this flat deck was to use it, to sit there, to stroll there, to be out in nature. And of course, the French alcove for beds. Most people in America didn't catch on to this or like it, but Jefferson loved it. And what I find probably most compelling, I used to think of this high central room in the house as a nod to Palladio's Villa Rotunda that has a tall room with a skylight. I now think of it as Paris because there are 6 or 8 or a dozen new houses in Paris when Jefferson lives there, where you walk in the front door into a central dining room that's very tall, that has a skylight, and it's followed by a drawing room. So I think that's what the Poplar Forest dining room is. It's Paris, 1790s. So again, this is a very short story. As Allison said, we now have this wonderful way to come in through the 600 acres of the landscape. We can also talk about what Jefferson did at Poplar Forest. One of his granddaughters said, "My grandfather was very happy during these sojourns in a comparatively simple and secluded district, far from noise and news, of both of which he got too much at Monticello." And so we can finally say that at the end of his life, Jefferson had the liberty to finally pursue his own happiness at this private, intimate place. Why didn't he invite anybody to see it? Probably because it was so special, he couldn't share it but with family members and a couple of friends. So, big story, short introduction, and I hope this whets your appetite to come down to Central Virginia. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to turn your attention away from Poplar Forest and Mr. Jefferson for a moment to talk about E.I. DuPont and his plan for Eleutherian Mills, which is where you currently are. Eleutherian Mills was the initial house, the black powder factory here on the banks of the Brandywine. So I hope you all got to see this drawing, which is on display down the lower gallery, which shows this as E.I. DuPont initially intended it whenever he built it in 1802-03. So what I want to go through with you this evening is why this looks the way it does. What did E.I. DuPont want in building a place like this? To answer that question, we start with his father, Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, who was one of the biggest adherents of an ideology, a philosophical, economic, political, educational, spiritual thing called physiocracy. And the idea that holds it all down is that a nation's wealth is derived from agriculture, from the land, and from productive work, which also includes manufacturing. So DuPont de Nemours came to this through his father, who was a watchmaker, so he got to work with his hands. He spent a lot of time out in the countryside, going back and forth, courting his first wife, being in nature. So he said that throughout all this, that he sees it, he thinks about it. What makes this special? You know, is it God? Is it the landscape? Look at these people working and everything that they're doing. So he starts thinking about it, writing about it, talking about it. Gets into the intellectual culture in the salons of Paris. So one of the people he meets there is none other than Thomas Jefferson as ambassador to France, but also important people like Jacques Necker, who ended up becoming the French Minister of the Exchequer, and the Baroness de Stael, who was one of the leaders in the intellectual culture, some of the salons of Paris. So DuPont de Nemours spends a lot of time talking with people in Paris about these ideas, meets this group of people who become the physiocrats, these people who shape him, who he shapes back. So they're batting around a lot of these ideas about education, about people, economics, a little bit of everything. But again, what holds this down is this idea that the land is important. So it's about what you grow, yes, but it's about the people who work there and how that serves your nation. So it's about having a nation that can sustain itself, an export rather than an import economy. It's about raising everybody up. So if you have productive work for everyone, including in manufacturing, that means everybody prospers. And it's not just lip service. It means everybody having good jobs, a place to live. Education is incredibly important in all this. And not just for the men in the society, the women as well. So everybody needs to have an equal education. So again, if everyone rises, the entire society rises. So through his connections with the intellectual culture, he gets to be known at the court of Louis XVI, particularly through the Madame Pompadour, and ends up as someone who has Louis XVI's ear. So he starts giving Louis these ideas, so this is what we want. We want everybody to be better. Do we want better commerce? We want agriculture. We want education for everyone. Louis XVI agrees with this and ends up sending him around Europe as a judicial, legal, political, educational advisor. So he ends up in Baden. He ends up in Poland. He ends up in Sweden, everywhere but Great Britain, talking with people about these ideas, about the physiocrats. So once the French Revolution kicks off in 1789, Pont de Nemours and the other physiocrats think this is great. We're going to be able to influence this thing in a big way. We're going to be able to shape society. But this all goes wrong pretty quickly. So once the terror starts in 1793, they're pretty disillusioned. They get disillusioned with what's going on. They feel like some of these folks are taking it too far, taking the ideas of the physiocrats, of others throughout Europe, and turning it in a direction that they didn't feel like it needed to go. So they were never against the king. They never wanted to see the king go anywhere. They wanted the king to reform, similar to what happened in Great Britain. Another step in this process is that Pont de Nemours and his youngest son, E.I. Pont, were officers in the French Garde Nationale. So they end up at the Tuileries Palace whenever it's stormed on August 10th, 1792, to get Louis XVI. So E.I. Pont and Pont de Nemours are the only two officers of the Garde Nationale to survive. So the entire Swiss Guard, which was Louis XVI Guard, were massacred. Most of the Garde Nationale, once they realized things were not going their way, they threw down their arms, pulled on the hats of a couple of revolutionaries, and sneaked out the side door. So E.I. Pont, nobody recognized him. He went back to the family publishing house in Paris and pretended it never happened. Pont de Nemours, however, being such a prominent person, was immediately recognized. So he spent about a month on the lam around Paris, and so he goes back to the Bois de Fossé, the family's estate, and does a lot of thinking about life. So that's where he authors his Universal Philosophy. This is a book that I will be honest to admit, I didn't wrap my mind around fully until relatively recently, thinking about the spiritual aspect of Pont de Nemours and the physiocrats. So what this book is Pont de Nemours working out the spiritual aspect of physiocracy, going through the terror, seeing blood flow in the streets of Paris, seeing this thing go so terribly wrong. What happened? And how can we fix it? So what is the real politic? How do people act and react in real time and not how we ideologically think they're going to act? So this is a monumental thing for him. He spends a lot of time really working this out, gets it published in 1793, tries to re-enter intellectual culture in Paris. So he ends up in La Force prison, which is, unbeknownst to him, the last step on the road to the guillotine. So he's there from July 22nd to August 25th, 1794. Lucky for him, Robespierre, who accused him of a lot of wrongdoing, lost his head on July 27th. So that gets Pont de Nemours out of the clink, so to speak. But this is kind of a life-changing thing for him. He ends up back in La Force in 1897 along with E.I. Pont for publishing what was considered inflammatory political tracts. So this is kind of the lead up to what does all this mean for Eleutherian Mills? So how does this apply to the Brandywine in Delaware of all places? Well, the family's thinking about why they need to stay in Europe. And not because they're afraid of losing their heads, but they know that Europe is in economic chaos following the French Revolution. So where do you go? What do you do? The only place that really is thriving economically in that era is Great Britain. And if you're from France in 1799, you don't really want to go to Great Britain. Because don't forget that there's going to be about 15 years of warfare. So they put together a business prospectus of things that they want to try. And they go to these people that they knew before, like Jacques Necker and the Baroness de Stael, who not only are intellectual leaders, but they are incredibly wealthy. So he's able to mobilize resources to say, hey, I've got this idea and I want to take it on the road. Thomas Jefferson comes back into play because he encourages Pont de Nemours and the rest of the family to come to the United States. What a better place to set up and do business than America? This is the encouragement that they're getting. Victor DuPont, who in the 1790s is Consul General to Charleston, South Carolina, reinforces that view. This is where you need to go. Come to the United States, young man. You can set up something and really make it stick. So Pont de Nemours puts together a prospectus, starts a company called P.S. DuPont de Nemours, Father and Sons and Company. They have a whole lot of stuff that they want to try, including real estate and land speculation. Dry goods, shipping, printing and publishing, black powder, manufacturing was 7 on the list of 9 things that they wanted to try. So that was not high on the list. But they wanted to try things, all things that they thought would do well in the United States, based on the conversations with later President Jefferson, based on the conversations with Victor DuPont. They come to the United States in 1800. One by one, the businesses fail, and they fail spectacularly in some cases. One being the dry goods business run by Victor DuPont out of New York, who had the incredible poor fortune of selling a lot of supplies to the French army on Haiti. So whenever they asked for payment, the French army pretty much told him to get lost. So that put that part of the business out of business. But also with land speculation, DuPont de Nemours ended up buying the same piece of property that 8 other people did in Kentucky. So one by one, everything fails, except, yep, you guessed it, black powder manufacturing. So E.I. DuPont is incredibly important to the story, not just because he started the DuPont company, but remember that he is front and center with Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours throughout the Revolution. So he absorbs these physiocratic ideas, ideals. He's publishing tracts. He knows this literature quite well. He knows the people quite well. He is right in the middle of all this. It's also important to point out his connection with Antoine Laurent Lavoisier at his ministry for powder and saltpeter. So yeah, of course, he learns chemistry from Lavoisier, but more importantly, in my estimation, Lavoisier was one of the leading physiocrats. So one of the things that you learned at Lavoisier's school for black powder, saltpeter, and mining was how to run a business and how to do it through the lens of physiocracy. How do you organize labor? How do you build a community around a factory so that people will want to do something incredibly dangerous and keep doing it? How do you get people to work in doing these things and build a community and raise people up? So the family makes the decision in 1801 to start a black powder factory. So E.I. DuPont made a plan. So I hope you all got to see this document, also in the case downstairs. So this is of the location and constructions necessary for the establishment of a powder factory. Not only does it talk about where the building should go in this black powder factory with space in between them, that way if there's an explosion you don't blow the whole place up, but most notably it includes a house for the director, in a place where the director can watch what's going on in the factory, but also be close to the workers' community, which is also stipulated in the plan. You have people live close to this factory. That way you are building a community. You see them, they see you. Yes, they see you sharing the dangers, but you are part of their lives and they are part of yours. So that's an incredibly important part of all this. So once landing here on the Brandywine in 1802, E.I. DuPont, of course, builds his house on the Brandywine, which is, whoops, get ahead of myself here. You can see it with the cursor. So the workers' community is right here. And part of the reason why he purchased this property is there were already houses in place from a textile factory that had burned in the 1790s. So he doesn't have to cut this from whole cloth. He can go in, set up, there's already a place for people to live. But this is, again, an incredibly important part of all this. So he starts the factory, founded the company in 1802, production commenced in 1803, first black powder sales in 1804. So back to this idea of building communities. So you've got the Eleutherian Mills residence, which is right here in the center. See if I can get my highlighter to work for you here. So you have a community here called the Upper Banks, which is right next to the black powder factory, which is here. So this map that you're seeing shows the initial expansion into the Hagley powder yard, which was in 1813, but there's also another workers' community here called Free Park Lane, or as the workers love to call it, Flea Park Lane. There was also another workers' community here called Duck Street and Chicken Alley, which is just across the river. Within E.I. DuPont's lifetime, there's another one just down the river called Walker's Banks. There's another one called the Henry Clay Community, and another one called Squirrel Run. So you have 6 individual workers' communities that get built along the Brandywine. And included with this are housing for these workers that the DuPont company built or bought houses that were already in existence. So the 3 drawings are by Eleuthera DuPont, one of E.I. DuPont's daughters, done in 1826, 1827. But this is an important thing for E.I. DuPont. to build houses for these people, to again build this community, set up a place where people can live, work, and exist alongside the powder factory. But along with this, work with your workers and take care of your people. So what you're seeing is a couple of pages out of one of the DuPont Company paybooks from the 1820s. And if you look closely at the paybook, you'll see the different lines for where people get paid, but also notice in there that they're paying for the Sunday school fees. They pay for the rent. There is a doctor that is on retainer, a fellow named Pierre Didier. They pay your pew rent at the church. They pay your school taxes. So these are all things which are part of what the company sets up for you. So again, it's part of building this community. And also the DuPont Company would let you keep some of your pay on deposit with the company, and after you get so much in the kitty, they pay you 6.5% interest on it. So again, they want these workers to do well. It's never a sell your soul to the company store sort of a situation with DuPont. They also set up widow and orphan annuities and widow assistance. So if you have a husband that gets killed in the powder yards, you as a widow will get $100 a year for the rest of your life unless you move away or get remarried. And also widows get preferential treatment for doing things like gluing labels on kegs or sewing the tops on Conestoga wagons. Your children, which are orphans, will get put into the apprenticeship program or get worked in somehow to be a worker in the powder yards. So this is an important part of this. Water rights and stewardship of water is an important thing. So it's about keeping the river clean, because not only is the Brandywine used to power the factory, but people use it to drink. So the image you're seeing is a satiric cartoon called The Fathers of the Brandywine. So the guy in the center is E.I. DuPont with Neptune riding on his back, pouring water into his pocket. And part of the idea of this is that E.I. DuPont bought both sides of the river so he could have full water rights to the Brandywine. Why is that? That way he can control what happens. That way he can make sure the river's clean, make sure that the resources are used well, so that you're not flooding out people downstream, that you're not flooding out your own factory. So water rights and stewardship are incredibly important. So is land stewardship. So this is E.I. DuPont's plan for his garden that he put in 1805. So there's an ornamental garden along with an orchard. So part of the idea of this is you have a pretty place to go and reflect, but you also have fruit. You have food that you can eat. And also part of this land stewardship was not just his garden, but making sure there were gardens to feed the workers. So the Winterthur estate, part of the reason why he purchased that, E.I. DuPont did, was to have a place to grow food. That way the people who worked for the company could eat. So he also built a store to sell the stuff at cost. That way they could get dry goods, have access to everything they needed. He also built this building called the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School in 1817. And the idea was that workers and their families can get an education. So it's not just about teaching kids Bible verses. It's about teaching people to read. Boys and girls, workers, adults, children, everyone who wanted to come, and it happened on Sundays. This is based off of the English model, the day that you're not working. So this is pretty important because they received an official charter from the state of Delaware in 1817, so it's one of the earliest chartered schools in the state. So education is important. Again, this idea of raising people up. So along with the community, you need a place to meet. So as you get critical masses of workers, he lets them use this as a sanctuary. So Roman Catholics meet here, Presbyterians meet here, Methodists meet here, and out of this comes some of the 4 major churches in our area. So as they get enough of a critical mass, they're able to split off, start their own congregation, and the DuPont Company helped underwrite building all of these buildings. So where I want to drop you off tonight with all this is that E.I. DuPont has a plan for the Eleutherian Mills powder yards. So it's not just about building a factory, it's not just about making money. It's this physiocratic idea of what do you do with a landscape? What is a landscape good for? How do you use these resources? How do you make sure that there's enough for everyone in the longer run? How do you build communities? And one of the biggest things that I am left with in studying all of this throughout my time at Hagley is how these communities that E.I. DuPont helped build starting in 1802 are thriving communities now. And if you don't believe it, come to the Irish Festival in Wilmington. And if you don't believe it, go to the Italian Festival in Wilmington. Because all these communities trace their origins back to not only these congregations, but the workers' communities near the powder yards. Thank you. So I'll invite Travis back up to the stage.
hear me? No? Yes. Okay. Looks, I'm still a little under the weather on all the DuPont connections with Jefferson. I know only of a few. Can you fill me in on a couple others?
I'll do one better. Why don't we ask Mr. Jefferson himself?
I declare, how are you? Nice to see you. My pleasure. How are you, sir? I'm delighted. Thank you very much. My pleasure. How are you, sir? I'm delighted. Nice to see you. Ma'am, how are you? Enchanté. Nice indeed. Gentlemen, what a delight. Nice to see you here.
Lucas Clausen.
Clausen, a pleasure. Nice to meet you. And you, sir, I am already well familiar with you as the savior of our poplar forest. Citizens, I beg your pardon that I should have stood a moment with my back toward you here this evening, but I heard my name mentioned just as I arrived. I find by my timepiece traveling up from my retreat here as poplar forest that I've made very good time. It only took me 8 days. You know you can never tell a horse what time to arrive. And I will tell you something most welcoming. As I dismounted out of doors, right just there beyond the door, what greeted me but a magnificent tulip poplar. Have you seen it there? They're my favorite tree, the Juno of the forest, for which, as you well know, my retreat house is named. Gentlemen, may I join you on the dais?
Please.
Well, here. I shall venture up here, and delightful to have this opportunity in your company, all of us here together for the most remarkably unrecorded moment in our nation's history, that we can all be together here tonight. And to welcome this, you know, I could not help but think that as I looked at my timepiece coming in and ever reminded of the great watchmaker of the universe, the great architect of the universe that the late Monsieur Dupont knew so well, and upon whom we often discoursed, that I thought to myself, may I be seated, ladies? Yes. You know, remember, I was brought up an Englishman, and we were taught never walk in the room where the ladies are seated and abruptly sit down. That's ill-mannered. You must ask their approbation to do so. So I think, not that I'm a friend of all things British, rest you assured, but I am a good friend of good manners, as the ancients said, manners make the man. So, and I've never known a DuPont that is not an example of that ancient statement. You're their friend within but a few moments, as I have always known. And here's the point, still holding on to my timepiece. I consider this, as the late Monsieur Dupont knew it well, to be the most valuable commodity man possesses. I mean not the timepiece, I mean time. Once it passes you by, can you get it back again? The ancients told us in kind, tempus fugit, but then they also provided us a most marvelous hope, carpe diem. And so it is this that reminds us about that, and therefore it crossed my mind. Do you know the one thing that Monsieur Dupont, the late Monsieur Dupont, that the late King George III of England, the late French King Louis XVI, and me all hold in common? All four of us can take a timepiece apart and put it back together again. I thought I'd just bring that up here as we're speaking about that.
So Mr. Jefferson, tell us about your connection with the Pont de Nemours. How did you meet?
Well, I had already heard about him. Everyone knew of the DuPonts, and I think it was because his son Victor had come here to our young nation, and this was during the early 1780s. If you will, he was a consul of France here in our nation in Philadelphia. And so many met him here, became friends with him, and of course he spoke greatly about his father, Monsieur Pierre Samuel Dupont, as being a good friend with Jacques Necker, of course, the great financier of the monarchy of France, a good friend of the Marquis de Condorcet, The late Monsieur Dupont, a good friend of Jacques Turgot, a good friend of the late Francois Quinet, that these gentlemen were all becoming known at this time as our war was approaching its end, as gentlemen devoted to the pursuit of the science of economy. They were economistes, as they had become known, suggesting that science can be pursued even in the improvement of agriculture and husbandry, that the ownership of land is essential, but it is not worth anything without the labor to attend to it. And therefore, together, you could utilize this science by more or less working out questions, raise objectivity in questions, and then apply through observation answers to it. They were very, very influential in what became the work of Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, which appeared that same year, 1776, as we declared our independence. So you might say that even before I arrived to France, that I was already familiar with the Dupont family and had the great pleasure to be introduced to him by the late Dr. Benjamin Franklin. Under rather sad circumstances, Madame Dupont had recently passed away. Charlotte, as we knew her, had passed away. That was just as I arrived. And so it was somewhat disconsolate when we first met. I cannot recall exactly where. It could have been at the Lorraine de Chameau Hotel Valentinos. They, of course, were one of the very first supporters of the American Revolution. It could have been at Versailles, where I was immediately to conduct business upon my arrival. It could have been in my very first hotel on the Rue de Tatabot, or later. Well, no, it would not have been later because it was within those first few months of my arrival. And it goes without saying, and I should not say it too assertively, nor spend much time. It could have been in the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, and we'll leave it at that.
So what was it about Pont de Nemours that drew you to him? You know, why him of all people?
Are we not drawn almost immediately, I made that statement earlier, to people of quite obvious spirituality? There just seems to be a welcoming in their eyes, in their face, in their smile. And I dare say that is certainly what has drawn me to so many people. The late Dr. Franklin I already mentioned, but nonetheless to the late Monsieur Dupont. A man of a great sense of the humanity within our universe. You might say yes, because as I referred earlier to the great architect, the great watchmaker of our universe, who sets all things in motion, and therefore the recognition that man is created to do good. It requires a faith. You know, the Quakers, I was introduced to their most wonderful philosophy when I first came to Philadelphia. I was only 23 years old. 1766, my purpose was to come up in this direction to be inoculated against the smallpox. And of course, you may all know the Quaker philosophy purports there is the divine in every individual. Each and every one of us are created in the image of God. Well, there it is. And so does that not require a faith in man? A faith in man, it does not mean that all things will go all well so often, no. There will be drawbacks, but that does not mean we give up a faith in man. We work with it to make it better. And I think in the immediate conversations, and particularly as nurtured with Dr. Franklin betwixt us, that I became almost immediately drawn to him and to ever remain a fast friend of his. You know, I had welcomed Dr. Franklin, and I almost hate to admit this, as somewhat of an interpreter. I say this not because I was not so familiar with the French language. I had learned it when I was a young man, growing up in the wilderness of Virginia, but because Monsieur Dupont found it very difficult to speak English. He spoke predominantly French, so there were times when he would misunderstand me, yes, even in my French pronunciation. But when I would say something, if I had to in English, and Dr. Franklin would then explain it to him. So that comes to mind as the very first instance, having been familiar with, that is, Monsieur Dupont, with those aforementioned individuals, Turgot, Voltaire, let alone Quinet, all of those gentlemen had shed their mortal coils before I arrived in France. Dupont knew each and every one of them. Dr. Franklin knew Voltaire. He was able to meet him when he arrived there, 1776. Knew him for several years before Voltaire passed away. But thank heaven also, not only for Monsieur Dupont, but also Dupont's good friend, the Marquis de Condorcet. The Marquis de Condorcet also knew the aforementioned and was good friends with Monsieur Dupont as well.
So how influential was Dupont de Nemours in Louisiana?
Oh. Citizens, I hope we never forget, I hope our nation never forgets that the plan we pursued for the successful purchase, first and foremost, of New Orleans, let alone with over 830,000 square miles west of the Mississippi River, was worked out in a plan by Monsieur Pierre Samuel Dupont, even before Robert L. Livingston and James Monroe, whom I commissioned as co-minister plenipotentiaries, arrived in France. You see, Monsieur Dupont was only here a short time after he arrived in our nation. He arrived, do you know, the Dupont family stepped foot on the shores of North America the very first time, and by the way, they were off course. They stepped foot on shore several hundred miles removed where they should have stepped offshore. They stepped on shore in Newport, Rhode Island, January 1st, 1800, the first day of the first year of the new century. Is that not remarkable? You cannot write fiction like that. And they then made their way down to New York, and so it was, they bought, there was property bought by them. It was in Bergen County. What did Monsieur Dupont call that? Good stay. A good stay. I received several letters from him at good stay. But the point of the matter is, he was here in our nation but a short time before he desired to return to France and oversee the investments in his, economiste community. Physiocrat community. That new word physiocrat is being used the more I hear to supersede economist. And he had planned that in far western Virginia. Correct me if I am forgetting, Mr. McDonald. Was it not in Kentucky that I believe he planned this? It was far west of the Appalachians. Yeah. And it all, I don't want to say it went bubble, but Monsieur Dupont had to return to France to work out further negotiations to dissolve that. And it was then that he began to work once he was back in France. We met in Philadelphia while he was here. We met in the president's house after I was elected. And then realizing the importance of the Treaty of San Ildefonso, that is, the importance it had upon us as a nation, that treaty, which was drawn together between King Carlos III of France and the French people as to, what would you say, secede a tiny little Italian kingdom known as San Ildefonso, governed by France, to give it to Spain. Do you know what the reason was? I remember hearing, simply to give the daughter of King Carlos, the princessa, something to occupy herself. And in return, then were besieged New Orleans. That is what we first learned. We were hopeful for the territory of Louisiana. But it was New Orleans that we were very concerned about, because at the same time this was all happening during that presidential election of 1800, and then afterwards, as I was the victor to take the oath of office, all happening at the same time. And so here was the necessity of deciding how could we maintain free trade on the Mississippi River, realizing our right of deposit was suspended in New Orleans. That right of deposit meant that as we continued to settle westward in our nation, that our farmers knew that they would have a ready market for their produce, send it down the Mississippi. If they had an overabundance, they could place it in warehouses in New Orleans, pick it up anytime they should choose, and trade with the rest of the world. That ended, and as a consequence, so ended that impetus for the further migration westward to the Mississippi, to which I had always said is our future, will be our new empire of liberty, to be settled by the 100 and 1,000 generation of farmers yet to come. So you see, Monsieur Dupont, the economiste, the physiocrat, knew well this was integral to the success of our nation, and particularly as his family had already come here to settle. He worked this all out to be ready for the scrutinizing and the negotiations that would be pursued by Mr. Livingston, Colonel Monroe, Talleyrand, of course, and most important, General Bonaparte. And that, we all know, resulted in a great success due to DuPont's plan in our favor.
Did DuPont de Nemours come to visit you in your retirement?
Yes, and I will ever lament the fact that when he arrived at my house, my mountain area, Monticello, it was the latter part of November, 18 and 15, that was the time when I had decided, I had already left about a week or so earlier to visit my retreat house, to visit Poplar Forest. I was not home when they arrived. I had not seen Monsieur Dupont, let alone his son Eleuthère, and I had not, nor Victor, I had not seen them since Monsieur Dupont left Washington City in 1802. And so therefore here was the opportunity, and I was not home. They stayed a good, I think it was about 3 days, nigh on 4 days. It was Victor who had accompanied his father. There was the Abbe Jose Carrera, who was with them, as well. He visited Poplar Forest later, as you well know. And one of the only two individuals from foreign lands who had visited, along with, who was the other? Was it Flower?
De Sequeira.
And Flower, was it not? The
George
English?
Flower, right.
Yes, only two. So you can imagine how secretive this retreat house has always been. Although you all know about it at present, do you not? It is a place, as you know, that I welcome family and intimate friends. So please consider yourselves welcome to come visit as soon as possible. Rest you assured. Lamentably, DuPont and his party did not set out to Poplar Forest. And the reason for that is because Victor had to return here to his business. He had to come back so very, very quickly. So they had to. And there was another concern as well. This was the end of November, and you know what happens as the winters come on. You just cannot possibly travel, even to meet family, if but several miles distant. So this was the time when they realized they would have to return home. Do you know they made such a mark on my granddaughter, Septimia? She was the seventh of my daughter, Mrs. Martha Jefferson Randolph's children. Septimia. She was a young little girl at that time. She was so beguiled by him and taken by him, and he was as well with her. I doubt there was not another correspondence from Monsieur Dupont was sent to me there at either Monticello or Poplar Forest in which Septimia was not mentioned. He always wanted to be remembered to her in each one of his successive letters.
So, friends, we've got just a few minutes left, and we'd like to open the floor if any of you have questions of any of us. Certainly, we've not stunned you all into silence.
I'm just curious, with the manufacture of black powder, began, I guess, right around the time of the War of 1812?
No,
It was before that.
All right, but wasn't, all right, but it was being done during the War of 1812, yes? Right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Did the British attempt to capture the facility? Did they shut down?
The British never attempted to capture the black powder factory, but they certainly knew it was here. So as soon as the British arrived at Elkton, Maryland in 1813, everybody here lost their minds because they remember back to 1777, the last time the British went to Elkton, Maryland. So they marched inland, fought the Battle of Cooch's Bridge, came through here, fought the Battle of the Brandywine, up to Paoli, then took Philadelphia. So don't forget that all the junior officers in the Royal Navy and the British Army were senior officers in 1813. So everybody here was well aware of that. The DuPont family, Victor and E.I., formed two companies of home guard that they called the Brandywine Rangers to protect the area. And nobody ever made a serious attack on this area, but they were certainly well aware and did what they could to protect the powder yards in Wilmington.
And I can tell you too, sir, though the Pierre Samuel DuPont had returned back to France in, I believe it was 1804, in my capacity as chief magistrate, I negotiated for Secretary of War General Henry Dearborn to initiate the first government contract for gunpowder with Elliott-Irénée. And of course, anyone remember what we were engaged in 1804? It commenced actually in 1801. We were still involved in it. The bull with the Barbary pirates, absolutely right. In which, yes, absolutely right. It served us well on the shores of Tripoli, did it not, in that great victory?
Yes, sir.
I have a question about the architecture of Poplar retreat. I mean, we understand it's a mix of several architectural styles, as the French one, the Greek revival, and some typical American one. But I wonder, how did you, Mr. Jefferson, how did you encounter with the Palladian style?
How do
The Palladio, you know Palladio?
Yes, Palladio.
In Italy.
Yes.
How did you encounter with this style? How did it happen to you that you like, you appreciate, and you discover it?
I certainly did, sir, at a very early age. I had the good fortune simply because my family had the means to attend to an education. And even though my father was deceased, only 49 years old, when he passed away, 1757, he left my mother a widow to preside over the rearing of 10 children. I was the eldest son. I hardly understood the weight on my shoulder, which, of course, was the weight of the British laws of primogeniture, primo first, genitor family, the eldest son in the family, to inherit all of his freeholdings. That's a British term. My father was a freeholder. He owned outright all of the land. That was 5 farms at that time, collectively 3,500 acres. And the same laws throughout all of our former colonies, of course, ensured that he owned outright the majority of the families living upon that land. I was only 14 years old. As I have written, how can a young boy 14 years old even begin to reason for what will befall him shortly? I understood it better when I reached my majority. 21 years of age in 1764, because though deceased, my father provided monies in his estate that I could continue my education. In fact, I've written the greatest legacy any parent may provide their children, particularly if called home too soon by our Maker. The greatest legacy is an education. That will return to you tenfold throughout your entire life. Another subject in which Monsieur DuPont and I were very much of like mind. My point is, as I was able to attend the Old Royal College of William and Mary, there was a bookstall across the street from the Royal College in Williamsburg. And that is where I purchased my first books on architecture. A James Gibbs book on architecture, Robert Morris's select book on architecture, and the 4 books of Andre Palladio. And then for the rest of my life, I think I was encouraged being able to go to France and see these morsels of ancient architecture, particularly in the south of France, to envision how that might be built here in the wilderness, if you will, in the forest primeval, and then in so doing, to perhaps add something that will make it distinctly unique in America. Yes, so that I think both in the design of Poplar Forest, let alone Monticello, and certainly in Clara Sow's design for our capital, in Virginia, in Richmond, there's something could be added that will provide it with that element of speciality, if you will, in the New World, in America. So that includes Palladio and all the aforementioned.
Thank you very much.
We have time for one more question.
Mr. Jefferson, this is a delicate question, but can you please...
I can assure you, madam, I've heard it before.
Okay. Who is the slave that you slept with to create artificial children? I'm just curious.
I have heard none the less and much, much more relevant to the inquiry that you have put to me, ma'am, in front of this polite society. I find it startling that such a question would come from a lady, and and I assure you, from everyone I've ever known throughout my entire life, in public, no gentleman would ever answer it. I will tell you a very interesting thing upon this particular subject, and Monsieur Dupont knew it so very well. It is represented by our Declaration of American Independence. And when I was invited to take pen to paper, I realized I could be writing our death warrant. But I had to put across what Monsieur Dupont, so many throughout the kingdoms of Europe, particularly in France and nonetheless in Great Britain, had already come to understand as the elements of the laws of nature and nature's God, to express that in an American sense, in the frame of the American mind. And so there it is. Everyone is born free. We're all born free and born into our own person here. That's expressed in the first two paragraphs. We're all born equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Nonetheless, for the family of man across the globe. But the greater part of our declaration, 2/3 of our declaration, reminds us most abruptly, and quite startling as well, we're born into the laws of man. It has ever been, it ever will be. That's the great contradiction. But there's never been a better opportunity in human history, now with the founding of our nation, to seek to rectify that. So therefore, when I have received this question, and I have never written or answered to it, I'm reminded of two particular things. Firstly, in the company of Monsieur Dupont, the two of us in the company of the Marquis de Condorcet, we were privileged to learn, I believe it was 1787, of Condorcet initiating Société des Amis de Frères Noirs, the society on behalf of the black brothers in man. That is a slave abolition society, of which DuPont was most favorable and supportive. We had this conversation many times. Marquis de Lafayette, our mutual friend, our good friend as well. I was asked to join, quite naturally. I could not. I was in the service of our nation, commissioned minister plenipotentiary, holding all powers of our nation's government, executive, legislative, and judicial. Think how that would have looked to be heard about at home by my neighbors, by my constituency, by our nation, upon such a highly volatile subject even then. But my mind has still been devoted through the majority of my life as well to seek a solution and to see that nothing is more assuredly written in the book of faith than these people ought to be free. That I hold in common as well with the late Monsieur Dupont. But with respect to the individual to whom you are referring, well, is it not curious? I am the one who always gets the question. Well, it makes me wonder that I should answer it when the individual of whom someone is referring is not standing next to me. So the bottom line to the question is one word, and that is, without any disrespect, but the word is respect.
So on behalf of Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest, Hagley Museum and Library, thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. Thank you, Travis.